Shaka ki rangiatia nei. Tukawana ia mātou ki toa a rimurapa a Tangaroa ki tae. He mihi tuaroa ki o tātou tini kārere manu. Kārerea ki uta, ki mopo, ki pō, ki tōroa ki tae. I haere ai ana ki tararawahi rā. Ka huri ki ienei waiwai. Ko tūpoko tahumata te mauka. Ko kana te awa, ko wairewa te roto. Ko Matiu, taku ingoa. Okay, kia ora. I'll begin. You can ask how a tahu ends up exploring the tropical Pacific islands. So given the kaupapa of, actually this is not loading up. Am I doing something? Can someone help load this up? No, it's going to go. There we go. Woo. So back in 2010, I got that one. I was part of a research project funded by the Australian government, where I've been based for quite a few years now, out to the remote Solomon Islands in Tikopia, the famous Tikopia, of the renown from the work of Raymond Firth, a New Zealander who was based at the London School of Economics and spent many a year on Tikopia documenting the ethnography of the island. And it's a long story, so I'll cut it really short, but basically we spent 2 months down on the island, and we arranged for the Inuitans, who have maintained a tradition, that's the neighbouring island of Tikopia in the Southeast Solomons, to take us back to the mainland in the Solomons. But Chief Number 2, Ariki Kawhika, the paramount chief of Tikopia, caught wind that we were employing the Inuitans to take us back to the Santa Cruz group. And he said, you're not taking their waka, you're taking our waka. And this was one that was gifted by a wealthy German who was very interested in exploring maritime technology and voyaging technology. And he literally had these built in the Philippines and then gifted them back to Tikopia. So here you can see it's sort of all loaded up with coconuts, as you should. Lots of bananas, lots of other produce. And there's the island in the backdrop. And we spent 3 nights travelling on this waka. And it was a real occasion because essentially the Tikopians haven't been voyaging between the different island groups since either the early 1900s or in the late 1800s. And the waka design here that you can see of the waka that we were deploying is based on some drawings from 1827 with Sanson on the Dumont d'Urville expedition to the Southeast Solomons. Now the beauty of an island like Tikopia, and I've spent a lot of time traipsing around the Pacific exploring really tiny islands, and Tikopia is only less than 5 square kilometres in size, and much of that's actually a lake in the centre. There's about 700 people that live there, but you get the feel in that place. It's so intimate that everywhere you walk you know that one of the ancestors has walked in that exact same spot. And there's a couple of places across the island where this is really quite profound. Like there's this one rock on this point where you know that every single person who's ever lived on that island has stepped foot on that particular point. So there I am back in 2010 doing that. And here are just some of the whare that, giving you an idea of island life. Still steeped in great traditions, such as the cleansing ceremonies of being coated in turmeric paste. And I sort of reflect on some of the archaeological work and environmental work that's been conducted on Tikopia over the years, set in stone really by the initial work of Raymond Firth. But here's Patrick Kirch, if anyone knows Patrick, when he was very young, being coated in turmeric. And this is Ariki Kawhika here. And the kaihutu of the tarai waka that we were on there was his son, who has now taken on the reins of Ariki Kawhika. So again, quite a prestigious occasion. In the backdrop there you can see some of the traditional, this is not Aotea tapa. It's actually Antiaris tapa, which is it's a different tree that people use for making and exchanging. It's an important part of the exchange ceremony and exchanging tapa. So my work out there, as I think Alex has pointed out a little bit, is to extract sediment cores from lakes and swamps and try and interpret past environments. And this is some coring work that we did on the lake in Tikapia. Here you can see sort of different images of it, between an image of Pat Kirch's and my own here, and showing how these environments might change. In fact, this island looks quite static. It looks like it hasn't really changed very much. But Tikapia is right in the middle of the cyclone belt. It's probably received on record more cyclones than any of the other Pacific islands of high intensity as well. So where the island literally just it's like a lawnmower going over the entire island and stripping it completely bare. But this creates a real sense of the community sustains itself even under these dire situations. So anyway, what I do is take these cores and we bring them back to the laboratory, and I've been based in Australia at the ANU in Canberra, and we bring back these sediments and we analyse them just like you would in an archaeological section, and you radiocarbon date different fossil remains, and you try and interpret the environment in that way. Now, one of the things I'm very interested in is commensal species. So these are animals like the kuri or the pig, or here's a little moko, and how they follow people around. Either they're being brought around the Pacific by way of waka, or some of these different species are actually indigenous to these islands, but by nature of the way in which people are reconstructing and transforming those environments, they become more abundant and thrive in a human and a cultural environment, or what I'm calling like a cultural ecosystem. So I'm not so interested in these big things like kuri. I'm more interested in these little things, so the pepeke, or the little insects that you can find, and other plants and weedy things that you might find in association with especially garden ecosystems. So recently, as Alex has been outlining, we've been doing a lot of work out on Ahuahu off the coast of the Coromandel, where I've been collecting numerous cores now and examining them back in the lab for picking out little seeds, pollen grains, insect remains, all sorts of stuff, which I'll sort of take you through, a sort of voyage through. Perhaps it's a third world we can talk about. We've been talking about two worlds, but this is yet another world of the underworld, if you like, that I like to call it, of these fossil remains and what they can tell us about the past and just how transformed our environments are. But also, really, and most importantly, understanding the adaptation process. It's not all a one-way street and humans come and we transform the place and everything's ruined. It's actually a much more dynamic situation than that. More pictures of Ahuahu and Tamuera, which he's already shown. So I approached Alex and team and Simon and Thane about working on Great Mercury, because partly I'm interested in these really small islands because of what they can yield. They often preserve the swamp deposits preserve really good fossil remains, that's part of it. But also thinking about the kind of mindset, the different theories that people came when they are colonizing a large landmass like Aotearoa. These small islands offer a unique opportunity to explore an island which would have been, in some senses, familiar, almost ready-made for Polynesians to actually arrive on. So that's one of the things I'm interested in. Where when you approach the mainland of Aotearoa, you're talking of a substantially different island. You've got Kodi for a start. You've got these huge, dramatic forests, which was something completely unfamiliar to Polynesians. So, whereas these smaller islands did not retain such substantial Kodi forests. So, one of these islands is Rapa. Someone mentioned Tōhaiadao earlier, and this is the famous pā site on Morongo Uta, which is in the upper ridgeline of Rapa, which Tōhaiadao excavated back in 1955. It was a really They just literally peeled off everything off that site. It was not the greatest of excavations. It's why archaeologists have often had a bad rap throughout the Pacific for a long time. But here's an image of 1934, which is more my interest, which is these substantial wet field, taro pond field systems, which you'd be more familiar with in some of the Hawaiian islands. So taro is king in Rapa, really quite dramatic landscapes. But these have largely been abandoned now. So I've been working on coring some of these systems, which are now sort of covered in grass and grazed by cattle and so on. So it's a really quite a different picture. Here's an image of a kōtero harvesting some taro in one of the swamps there, and me doing some of my coring work back when I was considerably younger. Anyway, and here's, yes, you can see some ditch line features indicated by the vegetation here, and some of these huge swamps that you have on Rapa. And in many respects, Ahuahu, to me, feels like a really similar place to Rapa. You've got pa sites, you've got monumental architecture in the form of these stone walls and other structures, large swamps for a tiny island. So swamps are always good for me because, you know, you're thinking fossils. And what I do, we collect cores just like this with very small cores. We collect up a number of them and then take them back to the lab, and along with some other colleagues of mine who specialize in different fossil remain types. This is my colleague Nick Porcher I work with, who's from Deakin in Australia. His work focuses, and I've been working with him for many years now, collecting invertebrates, insect remains, and trying to understand what insects actually tell us about the past. And I'm hoping you'll find it quite striking as we go through. So what about what happens when people first arrive? What did the place look like? What kinds of organisms were actually dominating those ecosystems? So we often think with Aotearoa, we're thinking of moa and we're thinking of all these huge birds and so on. But what about the underworld, as I will refer to from now on? There's a huge diversity of micro invertebrates, micro insects, and these are weevils. This is a head of a weevil with its nose. They have a long nose called a rostrum, and there's differing species. There's hundreds of different species, and these are all from Ahuahu Great Mercury. They're preserved. These remains here are about 4,000 years old. And if you think that's sort of representing some form of diversity, biodiversity, then get mites. Mites are absolutely incredible. So if it wasn't for all of the other things that we have in the world, like mites would be dominant. I mean, the diversity of mites is so incredible. And we find them in archaeological deposits. We find them in these pre-human swamp deposits from places like Great Mercury. So what I want you to think about is, what is really controlling, before people arrive, what is dominating those ecosystems? What is driving different ecosystem processes? And what I mean by that is, how does the actual ecosystem go from trees and how things are pollinated, all the different interactions between different species, right through to the decay process and what actually removes all of the decaying leaf matter and detritus and rubbish in the ecosystem, converting it back into nutrients, and then so the whole cycle of life can begin again. So there are some species which dominate. We know from long ecological scientific studies across the planet that like in New Zealand, it seems that moa are probably very important to the functioning of different ecosystems. In other parts of the Pacific, we know now from recent archaeological work that tortoises, like on the Galapagos Islands, were dominant. Like in Vanuatu, we've found large deposits full of tortoise shell, and they probably dominated those ecosystems. But they weren't present east of Tonga, and we actually think in these islands here, it's more likely to be things like seabirds. But also weevils, like the diversity of weevils and some of these other insects is so high. It's much higher than you would find in some of these western islands, on these islands, in remote French Polynesia and the Cook Islands. So it's probably similar. There's a lot of diversity going on. So how do, when Polynesians first arrived here, how do they affect that process? And does everything just disappear, or do some species thrive? And also, getting back to that voyaging question, what species might have arrived with people as well? So this is an image of Wharetaiwa Pānewhitianga there, where Cook and his crew in 1769 rocked up and collected a whole lot of plant specimens. So these are herbarium specimens, and if anyone wants to, you're free to. I visited there recently at the Auckland Museum, but there's the Banks Floriculum, which is one of the big collections of plants collected by Cook and crew, like Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. You can go visit them, and you can actually handle those specimens and have a look at those plants. Now, what I want you to reflect on as I start going through all the different fossil remains that we're seeing in these deposits on Ahuahu is that all the plants that they were collecting are found in what I'm describing as these early garden sediments. So they were actually collecting plants thinking that, well, these are sort of new plants that I've never seen before. But in actual fact, they were just walking through a fallow garden, or even a garden which it's very early in the season when they arrived in October for kumara. So they might have seen a few juvenile young leaves of the kumara plant, but they would have seen mostly weeds. So here is a specimen of puha, which we all know because it's the resurgent popularity in puha. Everyone's going mad for it at the moment. But this is an endemic species of puha. And this is something which I'll show you later, which we've got numerous seeds of this endemic puha in these early garden sediments on Great Mercury. So, okay, admittedly the Cook and crew were like seeing some of these kumara gardens on the hill slopes. This is it's off the coast of Gisborne there. But on Ahuahu, clearly there were similar gardens in operation. I've worked quite a lot up in Papua New Guinea, where people, it's one of the main staple crops of many parts of Papua New Guinea where people cultivate kumara. And it's very likely that this is the kind of production system that we were looking at on Ahuahu Island here. And part of that, and I think we need to sort of get to thinking about the technology that comes behind gardening. And we were talking earlier today a lot about how the natural world sort of drives people's thinking. And I think it's a similar thing with like kumara and some of these other plant crops, is that the plant's actually telling you how to cultivate it rather than you coming up with some kind of long tradition of how you should garden. It's actually, it's a pretty standard process of how you're actually going to cultivate differing environments. So I think that's really, really important to think about when viewing these fossil remains that I'll go through. So I was showing you a core from Tikapia before, and so you construct a chronology, and then here's all the different fossil types. I'm not going to go into it in any detail, and here's some of the fossil seeds that we find. This is put under a scanning electron microscope. Here's the endemic puha that you can see. It's actually quite rare now. I think that's one of the things is that we actually find these growing in the 15th and 14th century on Great Mercury, and quite a lot of abundance, a lot of seeds. Here's a puha seed here. But these puha are actually only known from a few localities throughout New Zealand now, so they're actually a threatened species. So partly because the introduced puha, the Sonchus oleracea, has basically dominated garden systems. It's so much more productive. Whether it's tastier, there's a lot of in the Māori community who I've met who think that this endemic puha tastes better, but I think, yeah, I'm hoping to sort of raise the awareness of it. So, and here are some other weed seeds that I'll talk about a couple of these plants as I go through. So we find all these different weeds that are growing alongside gardens. We also find burnt remains, because one of the things you have to remember about these early gardens is that fire is incredibly important for the processing of nutrients, converting fallow gardens, converting new areas into gardens. So people were burning constantly. Fire is not something that people were afraid of. It was something that you do every single day. It is basically, it's like breathing. You would be burning, 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 burning. And so a lot of these deposits were full of charcoal that we're working with, that Alex was outlining today. So that's really important to think about too, and what kinds of plants and animals can actually survive in that heavily worked over environment. So that's really important to think about. Some of these insects that we're finding too, so it's a similar array to the seeds that we find of these different weedy plants. And these are interesting as well. Like some of them are quite rare, but one of the things that you know, it's always an assumption when people come up and talk to me about this kind of work. It's like, oh, you guys know all that stuff already. But for a lot of these different insects that we're finding in these records, we know nothing about them. Some of them we haven't even been effectively described yet. And yet these are abundant in these early garden ecosystems, and we don't really know much about them. We know that some of these have been collected. They're quite commonly found in Auckland. You can go rummage around your compost heap and you might actually find some of these insects. You might find them in more, you know, not so nice areas around by the wharepaka and other places, but these things are really common, and they're basically serving an ecological function in these environments. So processing of decaying plant matter and other things that would flock around, and they really love living around humans. They love humans, put it that way. So we've got all these different remains. These are beetle wings and head capsules and all sorts of other stuff. Here's a bit of a close-up view. But the key importance with a couple of these species is that we not only find them in Aotearoa and places like Ahuahu, we also find them in the tropical Pacific islands as well. So these are a couple of species. This one in particular, called Cryptomorpha dajazinzi, which is a sylvanid beetle. You don't need to know all that stuff, but it's basically, it feeds on detritus of decaying plant matter, and it's quite likely, because we've never found any in the pre-human record, that this thing was actually introduced by Polynesians. And there's probably, this is a Dactylosternum marginale. There's all these names that you don't need to remember. We need to probably come up, I hope we can come up, like Te Tautau Whiri needs to come up with some names for these things. And so there's several of these species that we just really need to know a lot more about them. And so I'm quite excited with all that. I'm hoping to get some tauira, some rangatahi, some interested young people to take up the reins. So I don't just work in places like out in Ahuahu and in French Polynesia, but there's also doing similar work out in the Solomons and more recently in Samoa, digging up remains of old taro gardens. Here, these amazing dry stone wall terrace systems of old taro gardens in the middle of now what's occupied by dense rainforest in West New Georgia and the Solomons. And these are really extensive. There's hundreds of hectares of these things dotted in the valley, which were abandoned back in the late 1800s, and they're now just occupied by forest. And so, these environments are quite remarkable. You can see a stage. This is a base of an old wall, which has been, the top stones have been robbed to build another wall. And we're just excavating, trying to look at how these things were constructed. But again, I'm looking for fossil remains. I'm trying to think, well, you know, what was happening in the past in the environment here? Here we are in Samoa, coring swamps. Again, this is from similarly an abandoned taro field system. These are huge valleys which were entirely used for taro production. And so we're doing similar work there, coring with some boys back, and then looking at stream sections and all sorts of other kinds of deposits, trying to figure out what's going on. Someone mentioned Tubuai before, so I thought I should throw that in. I've been doing similar work on Tubuai, Rimatara, a number of other islands, including in Tahiti, looking at these ancient garden ecosystems. One of the groups of organisms which Nick Porch, I mentioned before, and I are very interested in, we've been collecting ants from right across the Pacific, including in Aotearoa, trying to get a handle on the diversity of ants and what ants mean, because ants are probably the most successful invertebrate that we can think of in terms of getting around the planet and colonizing everywhere. So this is similar to the record I was showing you before. This is sort of pre-human here. Green we think are these indigenous taxa, and in blue here we think these are Polynesian introductions. So this is this one island, Rimatara, which is another really tiny island. It's only 4 square kilometres in size in French Polynesia. And we've got about 10 or 12 species of ant that were introduced by the first people that arrived on that island. And then later you can see Europeans introduced a whole bunch more species here in red. So you can see, and there's actually, it's quite interesting patterns, because sometimes species might arrive, but then they die off. They might come back. So there's all sorts of ecological information in here. We've found some really, really nasty species which have huge impacts on ecosystems. So this is called the yellow-eyed crazy ant. And it's renowned for, it's currently found on Christmas Island off the coast of Australia, and it's renowned for actually endangering the large Christmas Island crab. So that's highly threatened by these ants, which eat seabirds, they eat gecko, they eat everything. And yet that thing only survived for a short time on Rematara. So there's all these different questions which we've got no idea about, but it just represents a really dynamic, really changing environment that these species are responding to all sorts of different things, mainly that humans are doing, because humans are really driving these ecosystems in many respects. That's just showing that on Facebook, you know, Puha is really popular along with other, this is the Kaimāori website, which is well subscribed. Alex described the Waitetoki excavations, and so I won't go into that in any more detail because I think he's covered enough there just with the drains. But what I would show you is what some of these ecosystems look like. So I've worked in places like in southern Vanuatu, where we've got these are irrigated taro gardens, but they're called raised bed gardens, where people would dig a ditch and they'd pile the diggings onto the terrace where they'd be growing taro, and they'd be supporting banks with dry stone wall bunds. And that's likely what those early gardens were looking like on Ahuahu and elsewhere, probably in northern New Zealand. So that's an image from Matthew Spriggs from 1980, but I went back there recently and doing some more work on that site, and this is the chief of Umage Village. Umage Village is renowned for, it's a fabulous place. All these places are fabulous, of course, but this is the place where you can get the strongest kava in the Pacific. So you've got to be prepared to go there because they'll make sure you get the strongest kava in the Pacific, and you might not wake up the next morning. But anyway, they make these wonderful raised bed taro gardens there up in these valleys, and it's, you know, it's just really interesting seeing how that's done. And here's some raised beds, similar systems from Raivavai. This is one of the subtropical islands in French Polynesia. So they're quite common. They're probably the simplest form of taro gardening construction of wet taro that you can do. So that's partly why I think, you know, these are important. And what's interesting is you look at the drains, you're running around these different gardens, and you can see, here we go, here's some watercress. So, you know, there's all these other potential plants of economic value, cultural value, that are growing in and around taro and the different infrastructures that people create. Quickly running through some of the species. So here we go, here's some of the, these endemic watercresses. These are found in these early garden sediments from Ahuahu, but again, these are very, very rare now. You can see I can identify them from these really distinctive seeds, and here's the introduced watercress here, so very different seeds. But these things were responding to changing nature of garden production on these islands. And here is the same watercress collected by Cook at Wharitaiwa. So, you know, these things were far more common in the past, but now are really threatened. So I'm sort of, you know, we can talk about endangered people and endangered everything, but this is a classic. This is like I think a really important cultural plant that we should be thinking about. There's that puha, just showing its distribution. It's found all over, right down to Rakiura, where we've got the NZAA conference next week. So you do find in some localities the endemic puha as well, but, you know, they're not that common. So now I talked about fire a little bit, so we find these charred seeds. This is a plant here which I think when you arrived in certain parts of New Zealand, the problem with New Zealand today is it's covered in grass. It's not just because of dairy farming and sheep farming, it's just grasses everywhere. But that's predominantly a European thing. So we've got these different herbs which this would have covered the landscape, and that's actually quite rare today as well. Anyway, I think I'll just acknowledge, I was going to go on. The last thing I'll talk about is, if anyone who's, you know, obviously you're all interested in the Bay of Islands, but Joseph Hooker's diaries of his travels around the Bay of Islands was transcribed last year. But he was quite interesting in the sense that, you know, he had a really good eye for both plants and animals and ecology and different processes. And as he was walking around in 1841, He describes a lot of these different weeds and plants, etc. But one of the things he notes is like, oh, well, you know, why are New Zealand plants not so vigorous, etc. But in fact, we've got some plants which are found in these ahuahu sediments like oxalis here, Tutai kahu and Tutai kaka. Yep, you can think about how that name came about. And it's actually invasive in the UK. So we do have these plants, and maybe there is some relationship with the way in which people are gardening. We've been gardening here for over 700 years. Some of these species are probably responding to you know, these plants which can then become invasive in other parts of the world. Similar to, we've actually also got some micro snails that do some similar things that are highly invasive in other parts of the world. So that could be responding to the way in which people have been gardening and using the landscape. These species are responding and adapting, and then as they get transferred to other parts of the world, they become invasive. So we too are creating these agricultural kind of, you know, species which are taking over and going on their own voyage. Just, yeah. Ka mutu. Kia ora.
So in ahuahu, did you find any seeds and/or associated invertebrates that might have indicated some failed introductions from earlier times? Is there anything that stumped you there in the...
Well, I don't know about fail, but they indicate they come in for a short period and then drop off, but that could be due to change in production system. So we do know that the early taro gardening probably didn't last very long on the island for various reasons, but then maybe the production focus shifted to kumara, and therefore all of the different insects and plants and weeds that were associated with those gardens changed. So some of them dropped off. So, and I'm expecting that all of those plants probably were introduced, so from the mainland, but the other alternative is that you have to think about what kind of environment they might have existed in before Polynesians arrived, is that they were occupying perhaps seabird burrows or some environment which is annually and regularly disturbed. The soil's being churned up and those plants are growing on sort of nutrient-rich environments. So they might have been existing on little seabird burrows that were located on the tops of these islands. Who knows? But yeah, there is that possibility. We need more records. We need to go to more spots and find out about these things.
Kia ora. A question. It's often said that our shrub and tree species have particular insects,
yes,
vice versa. And this is one of the characteristics of the ngahere of New Zealand. Look at the one tree, you should know what the expectancy to affect certain insects. So I'm assuming the way you're nodding, it makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Someone who's trying to understand?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are insects called generalists, so they would actually, you know, live on all sorts of different plants and trees. But then there are species-specific co-evolved relationships whereby a particular insect might be a specific pollinator for a particular kind of flower. You know, you can think of the hummingbird and so on. There are those sorts of relationships here, quite often with the weevils. So there's been a lot of work done on those weevils, and they, because of the nature of their rostrum, their noses, they are meant for feeding in really highly specific places. Those are the sorts of relationships that, you know, we've got what are called entomologists, insect specialists who work on that stuff. But again, New Zealand's untapped there's a lot of work to be done. It's a great opportunity for students working on that stuff.
My particular question is, so you go out and you do all this work and you look at insects, you look at invasive species and all that on the land. If I was someone in the Pacific listening to your thing, would I have the opportunity to in your research into some sort of thing that's going to help my people in the future?
Oh, okay. Whoa, yeah. I mean, that's what we say. I mean, I think there's multiple things. So I think a lot along the lines of archaeologists, where we're looking at heritage protection, understanding these past environments before they're developed. But then I'm also look at development, especially in the Pacific Islands, where a lot of these traditional production systems have been abandoned, and that's through importation of cheap, poor quality foods. And then you look at the nutritional component of these traditional production systems and go, wow, it would be really great if we got these going again. And by doing this work, we can basically reaffirm with local people who might have traditions about their old gardens, but it also sort of emphasizes, that these are dynamic, but that, that they are very important. And that, I think when you can demonstrate that people have been doing this, potentially in the Western Pacific, for example, for thousands of years, that really adds to the story of like, well, okay, this is just something that when Pākehā arrived, you gave this up, or you're impacted by colonization. Let's return to some of these production systems. So I think in that sense, it's really emphasizing that deep heritage, deep time connection with place.
Yeah, I guess the point is don't leave it in the lab.
Ai, tika tēnā. Well, this is another question, and I haven't been working much in kauri-rich areas, in the Waitakares or anywhere like that. But it is possible that you could find some kind of insect relationship, as they've found in Europe, for example, the Dutch elm decline. There was lots of work done with fossil insects that traced that there was this massive expansion of some of these insects which feed on elm, and there was a massive dieback of elm. And it's quite possible we could find similar points in the past where kauri died back. So, yeah, I mean, it's, plenty to find out.
Nā reira me mihi atu ki tēnei o ngā rangatira o te Waipounamu, rā kautau, o mai te paki.